Hello everyone, it's good morning for me on a fairly nice day. We've had some good weather over the last few days, I hope you have as well. My name's John Patrick, I'm a retired professor in biochemistry paediatrics, but the last 25 years have been spent mainly in talking about ethics, culture, faith and public policy in universities around the world, paid for by wonderful American physicians whose names I don't even know. That's America that I know, and so many Americans don't seem to know it. New York and San Francisco and LA are not the America that matters as far as I'm concerned. But perhaps more of that some other time. I'm going to talk today about the week I've had because it has raised interesting questions. The week was essentially enlivened for us by the visit of a young man in his mid-20s, married with a 5-year-old, but he came on his own, a long drive from Middle America, basically to talk books with me. I've met him a few times. He apparently spent a week in our home some years ago when his father came to a program we ran at Augustine College for physicians. I remember him coming, but I don't remember him staying for a week. But what mattered most to him were our bookshelves. And I'm always delighted if I introduce people to better reading than they would otherwise have, and that happens quite often. So certainly it had happened for him. He was currently unsettled about belief, and he's trying to bring up his child in a secular environment where the child makes their own choices. It's a common phenomenon these days, has been for some years. Of course, the only real problem with this is that neutral secular environment doesn't exist, because all environments all have a history, and the history determines outcome to a very large degree. We had very interesting conversations. Whether that it'll take him any further along the line in either direction, I'm not sure. But the one thing that is certainly true is that multiculturalism is essentially a lie landed on us by tacit atheists who want to feel good about themselves. Everybody inhabits a culture, and that's what we should be talking about. Race is ridiculous. Talk about culture, because as black people who've grown up in America find when they go to Africa, they haven't come home. The culture is very different, and until they go, they're not aware of it. When they try and straighten things out, historically, we all have histories that we can't go back on. I mean, we were conquered by the Normans, 1066 and all that. But we don't speak French now, but there's plenty of bits of Norman culture to be found around England, architecture, but even names, There was a Du Maurier in my class in high school. He was certainly not French in any way, he was English. Over time, cultures are modified by one another, but there is a culture where you grow up, unless you're very unlucky indeed, and of course that does exist now. And the culture only flourishes where families flourish. It's not possible without. Read Solzhenitsyn. If you've never listened to his Harvard commencement address, which was not appreciated by the Harvard crowd, go ahead and find it. It's easy enough to find. So the week was a lot of books lying around our house by the end of the week. And I certainly enjoyed it, and I think Caleb did too. Well, he said he's going to come back again sometime. His wife must be extremely patient to let him off for almost a week. Now, so I want to talk about what are the fundamentals that have to be addressed in any human culture. And I think the first one, and one that the modern post-Christian, post-everything secularist doesn't want to discuss, is the most important. Is the truth about us that we are actually flawed but know the truth? That's the Judeo-Christian story. we're all sinners. We all know it from early childhood. Children are moral beings. They ask moral questions. They presume moral positions in their speech without knowing that, of course. Not fair is my favorite example, as I've said many times on this podcast. It's not a sophisticated statement, but it has huge ramifications. On what basis do you say not fair? Or is the basis for that justice? And of course, my secularist friend, who doesn't want to impose on everyone, just wants us all to be loving and kind, well, loving and kind to whom? The Bible talks about the time of year when kings go out to fight. And in the Western world, Louis Constant, certainly Western Europe, small petty fiefdoms calling themselves kingdoms were fighting one another for years. And they didn't have any guilt about that. That's what they did. It only slowly came out that this wasn't the best way to do things. But we haven't succeeded, have we? All we did in the end is we managed to stop the internal fighting over petty fiefdoms, and we ended up with major things like World War I and World War II. And now you see the battle is between huge numbers. China's failing communist state descending as usual into brutal tyranny. Is that an improvement of what they've had in the past? Go read some Chinese history. I mean, they were way ahead of the rest of the world technologically, 15 centuries ago or something like that. That's probably too much. 500, 600, something like that. I'd have to look it up to be sure. But it's worth reading about. The easiest place to read about it, I think, is probably Neil Ferguson's Civilization. So, we've always had wars and rumours of wars and cruelty and slavery. I mean, the idea that slavery was a Western idea is so ludicrously without any sort of factual basis. And the reality of slavery throughout the history of the world is undeniable. It's everywhere. The Bible talks about slavery. It's chattel slavery rather than the brutal slavery that the Romans used. If you were sent to the mines, you weren't going to survive very long. And of course, one of the things that eroded slavery dramatically was the arrival of better sources of power. Robert Fogel did his first PhD work in economics on the economics of slavery, and being a liberal Jew, he thought he would easily demonstrate that it was a silly idea in the first place. But he was an honest intellectual. He found, no, it wasn't. It did actually work financially for some people. And in the long run, of course, the slaves that came from Africa here out of the slave environment, Benin has only just recently admitted that basically Benin was run on slavery. That was their main product, so to speak, and they sold to all sorts of other people, including Europeans, but also to their own people. So to me, the first question is human nature. I think we know good and evil, but we can't do it. To me, the most straightforward, honest description of human life is the good things that I want to do, I often fail to do. And the not so good or evil things that I really don't want to do, I often end up doing. That's, I think, a description that everybody has to accept, unless they're totally unwilling to be introspective to any degree at all. That, of course, is St. Paul in Romans 7. But it's not only him. But it is a problem that if we want to feel really good about ourselves, then we end up lying to ourselves, because the truth is upsetting, if you're honest about it. The only comfort is we're not alone, we're all the same. A bubble overhead, our heads showing our thoughts to the world would not be a livable environment. That we have a secret inner life is the only way the inner life can be managed. Just get used to it. When you're married to someone and you think you get to know one another, they go on surprising you for the whole of your life. sometimes in a good way, often in a sad way, but it's a two-way street. We all do it. Our secret lives, which one day, the Christians believe, will be shouted from the housetops. It's not something I'm looking forward to. So the secular world has a problem immediately. How's it going to maintain order if there is no power? And the answer, it can't be done. And of course, the power that worked best in the sense of producing environments that didn't need a lot of government is Judeo-Christian thought. I'm trying to remember, I think it was Taylor, A.J.P. Taylor, who wrote about the history of England around the Edwardian and First World War time. And he said, in the early Edwardian period, most English people had no real interaction with officialdom beyond the postmistress, and they could go anywhere in the world that they wanted to go. You didn't need a passport. You had to make arrangements with banks in order to have access to money and letters of credit and all that sort of thing. But no, we didn't have the stuff we're having now. And the idea that is current in the US at the moment, the first thing every nation has to do is guard its borders. Well, when the British Empire was flourishing, it didn't work that way. One of the real pleasures of doing medicine in London was that you had a constant flow of young doctors doing a round-the-world trip, bringing with them, of course, interesting stories and different ways of looking at things. But they didn't have any problem. I never heard of anybody. I don't even know whether they had to do anything to get in. The border might ask them, do you have any evidence that you got a job? But I don't know whether they did or not. I never actually thought to ask them. But they came from... the sequence, of course, was that Australians, New Zealanders and South Africans, and to a lesser extent Canadians, could cycle around that process with England in the middle. And one made some very good friends that way, and their characteristics led to a lot of humour. Can't resist telling this one. I had a friend which I lost contact with. I imagine he's probably passed on by now, because we're in the stage where we ought to have passed on. But this would be in the early 60s, and he was a little older than me, a few years. My registrar, senior resident in my junior years as resident, if you like. And Nick, his father was a bishop in Australia, in Queensland. And although Mick was far from anything you would call a practicing Christian, he was a wonderful guy. Everybody liked him. And he was very Australian, in that he called things what they were. And apparently his father did too. His favourite story about his father was his father being called by the Archbishop of Australia to go to some sort of conference with the other bishops. And Mick's father sent a telegram back saying, "Bishops are rather like manure, no use in a heap, best spread around the place, I ain't coming." That's Australia. And when we went there, of course, we met some of that. But now, sadly, they have the woke problems of not wanting to offend any other. In other words, putting other people's feelings above any concept of truth. Now, you can't do medicine on that basis. It's not possible. What you have to learn is how do you speak the truth to someone you know doesn't want to hear it, but they need to hear it because they've got to deal with it. Real human interactions are not concerned about other people's feelings. Another mixed story, since it comes to mind. One of the favourite patients of Paul Wood that came through the National Heart Hospital was the guy who owned the biggest, in those days, the biggest gambling system in London called Ladbrokes. He was a Jewish guy. His name was not Ladbroke. And he had heart disease, which was getting towards the end, and we didn't have the drugs we have now. We had some, but we're not as good as we have now. But he really loved going to watch horse racing, particularly steeplechase over the Styx. The Cheltenham Gold Cup was the race of the year, and he always went. And he also liked beer, which is a good source of salt. So if you drink a lot of it, which he would like to do and did at that occasion, he was going to go into congestive cardiac failure. His chauffeur knew that, and so shortly after lunch, he had the rolls running, so to speak, and got his boss into the car and drove like the clappers back to London, to the National Heart, which was the only place he'd go. And he'd come in breathless, and he'd come in the night before this particular story, and it wasn't that bad, and we squeezed some salt water out of him, and it was much better by the next morning. And when Mick and I went round to see him, he trotted away with fine. And then he said to Mick, "Go and see if those two crows are outside, and if they are, tell them I ain't going to go, and they can leave." And we went outside, and two Orthodox Jews sitting there. And Mick said straight, "Your dad says you two old crows can leave, he's not going to die yet." And they got up and left. I hope that Mick had a good life. If anybody knows anything about him, Mick Robinson, Australian cardiologist, do drop me a line. I'd love to know a bit more. What I'm getting at is that even humour is culturally dependent. There are cultures where you certainly can't make jokes about all sorts of things. And I mean, for a long while, you couldn't make jokes in England about the royal family. That changed in the late 50s, early 60s with Beyond the Fringe, basically, which later led to the Pythons. And of course, throughout history, kings had jesters who had the right to make fun of them. It was dangerous because they could lose their temper and the jester could lose his head. But by and large, it was accepted that a jester could say some things which nobody else dare, which probably need to be said. And the jester was kept for that reason. Humour does that. And we really need more of that. And I mean, it is coming back. I think one of the ways in which this incredibly stupid culture that we produced, when I go to talk to students now, there are people in the audience who are just waiting to be offended. I can't imagine what it's like when the highest point of your day is to say to somebody else, "I'm offended by that statement." Yeah, I can't imagine what a life like that would be. I mean, to be made fun of, you learn how to do it, and of course, to laugh at yourself a bit and see the stupidities that we're all capable of all of the while. I mean, in a way, what I'm doing at the moment amuses me at one level, in the sense that somebody up there has got a sense of humour that I should end up doing this sort of thing. But really good humour always carries a little edge, doesn't it? And it's so memorable, and it lightens the heart. There certainly wasn't enough humour in the church where I grew up. They weren't humorless, they were nice, kind people, but they're a bit dull in that sense. A really good response to a situation, which can be on the edge of impolite, is wonderful. I mean, the famous Churchill interaction with Lady Asquith, where she met him at a cocktail party, and he was drunk, and she said, "Winston, you are drunk." And even though he's drunk, he came back, "Madam, you are ugly, and I will be sober in the morning." And I mean, that's an immortal Churchill saying, and it still makes people smile. And that's good for us. We need it. It's an abreactive process. And where I grew up, we were poor, but I didn't know it. Nobody was rich in our street. But they didn't complain about it. The first time you go to your dad when you've been beaten up a bit or whatever, and a dad was as likely to say, "Oh, just suck it up, kid. That's the way it is. You'll survive." That's a wonderful characteristic. Carry on, the notices during the war, stiff upper lip. And Lewis writes about it. So every now and again, in Screwtape Letters, you get some side lines on this. And by the way, if you haven't found John Cleese reading the Screwtape Letters on YouTube, dig them out. He's the perfect reader for that. So the culture determines what you can say and what you can't say. I mean, in Thailand, to have said anything about the king would have been, it could cost you your life. To say anything against Muhammad in Muslim lands is a very dangerous thing to do. But England didn't do that. You could say what you liked, and we ought to go back to that. You have to take the flack that comes back, because if you say something stupid, you're going to be the loser in the long run. We discussed that this week. I don't think I made much progress, but a little perhaps. Certainly my own turning from a much more nominal understanding of faith, in the sense that I could see it was a good way to live. The somewhat dull people that I met in my church were nevertheless good and kind and caring. Particularly, no one in that church would be worried about growing old. The church would find a way to take care of you. They didn't have the money to send you to homes. After my mother died, my father never had Sunday lunch on his own in the rest of his life. The church. 2 girls in particular. No, 3 women actually. 2 younger ones who took him his father, and 1 a bit older. And my father had lunch every Sunday. And if anything needed to be done, they did it for one another. That's really a wonderful environment. I never had to worry about my parents, although I was across the water for the end of their life. Yes, I regret that I didn't visit them as often as I should have done. But those are the kinds of regrets we all have at the end of the day. But cultures like that, where everybody knew everyone else, and when the worst came to the worst, they were helpful. They're good. There was very little petty theft. There was some, of course, that never affected our family. I went in elementary school, we didn't have lockers. Everybody, if they had a coat that they wanted to hang up, they could hang it up and leave things in their pocket or hang a bag there. Only once in 6 years was a significant theft. And the headmistress gathered the whole school in the assembly room, and we sat there until the thief owned up. It wasn't that long, I can't remember how long, and he was duly caned, and that was it. 6 of the best, and it was finished. There was no viciousness in the caning. It was a finality. Words are much more damaging than physical treatment. There's nothing so untrue as sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but your bones will heal. But I've certainly seen people over the years that were permanently scarred by throwaway lines from parents when they were very young, often overheard lines. Psychiatrists can keep you for hours with stories of such people. Now, what we say, I was just reading the Psalms this morning, and it was about David asking God to guard his lips. Yes, we all need our lips guarded. That was discussed this week. So I don't think that one can build solid social structures if they deny that reality. The flawed image, knowing what is good, but not capable of doing it perfectly, continuously. The teaching of Jesus is, of course, in the parable of the vine in John's Gospel. He says, if you stay close enough to me, you will be all right. But without me, he actually says you can do nothing. Are we really that dependent? Probably we are. The other good thing I did this week, I woke up in the middle of the night twice, and I don't try and go back to sleep. I have 2 distinctly different ways. One, involves reciting the Sermon on the Mount to myself, because I know those 3 chapters. And I usually say most insomnia is roughly 12 verses. But every now and again, I know I'm more awake than that. So I get up. And this week it happened twice. And the first time I read the whole of Ecclesiastes, only 10 chapters, doesn't take very long. And I thought, that's a book that the modern young person could read, because they're becoming aware of the difficulties with this feel-good society we're trying to produce, which is becoming more criminal, drug-addicted and the rest. And there's Solomon writing about what he's discovered with his wisdom, and ending up with the famous lines, if you don't know them, you should learn them. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, when the evil days come not, where you shall say, I have no pleasure in them. We are now dealing with that, and Canada is leading the world in this process by offering and encouraging euthanasia at the end of life. The bureaucrats love it because the only thing they know is the fact that we spend most of our healthcare dollars in the last months of our life, not even years. So if we got everybody to die 6 months earlier, our health figures would be much better. That logic carries on down the line a long way. I mean, there are certain kinds of people whose behavior creates huge medical problems. So apply the same logic and you're into an awful world. It's not the way we should live. But we're doing it. We're also setting out to get rid of a whole bunch of children with inborn errors of metabolism before they're born by abortion. We can diagnose them in utero. That's not treatment, though. And those who are persuaded that this is the best thing to do are going to find that that doesn't mesh with their feelings later in life, particularly when they come across someone else who said no to that and kept a child. I'll never forget one afternoon, a lady came in with her severely handicapped child, who, to be realistic, was not a pretty sight. And she'd been crying. I said, what's happened? And she said, a woman on the bus said to me, why didn't you have that thing aborted? I said, that's horrible, isn't it? I think perhaps I can help you a little bit to think of it differently. I suspect that that woman probably had an abortion for a much more trivial reason than that. And to see you pouring your life as you have done into that child was like a slap in the face. She felt guilty. So you were just the recipient of a backlash from that guilt. But that guilt may yet turn her to be more honest and therefore a better person. The handicapped children have that capacity to stop us in our tracks. And if we get rid of them all, we won't be a kinder, nicer place. We'll be even more brutally narcissistic than we are now. That's the world around us. Religion is civilizing. Evelyn Waugh, the famous novelist, was not a nice man, and he acknowledged he was not a nice man, but he was a committed Catholic. And he was chided about the mismatch between his being somewhat acerbic and rude. And how does that fit with your Catholicism? And his response was, I'd be a lot worse without it. And of course, he's right. He wrote beautifully, but there was always that tinge in his writing. But if you're open to it, this struggle between his bad habits and what he knows ought to be the case. But we don't read good books anymore that challenge us in that way. So we have another major problem. I mean, this week, Caleb probably went away with half a dozen titles of books because he is reading. And that will probably be the best thing that happens to his son, so to speak. That's the way it works. But history in particular is not being taught honestly. We we have become so dishonest for political reasons, like the George Floyd affair that's now crumbling at the seams. It was known early on, of course, that he had enough drugs in his body to kill him without anything else, but that was not widely presented, although the psychiatrist, the pathologist who did the post-mortem certainly said it, and it appeared in various forms of select media, I suppose. That's typical of what happens in our world today. But what are the antidotes? And what are the causes? The biggest cause, which I think is now recognised for failure of moral development in young men in particular, is absentee fathers. A boy has a need of a male influence because he's got to live in a male world. If he's brought up in an entirely female environment, he goes looking for the father he didn't have, and the only place he can go, on the streets. That's a bad outcome. We all know what will happen if you live on the street. So, if we taught an honest history in school, and if we read the Bible in school as we used to for centuries, simply because it is the book that made the Western world, all great cultures have great narratives. Pagans have the book of nature, which is overwhelming and breeds awe and fatalism. Hinduism and the Eastern religion developed the capacity to self-examine in a way, and they want to get ignored, absorbed into the nothing as the end of their world. They're fatalists too. Jews and Christians are the least fatalistic people in the world. Muslims stand between the two groups with a somewhat legalistic, in my view, heretical version of Judeo-Christian thought. And of course, that at the moment is one of the areas of change that beggars belief. If somebody had told me what is happening today in places like the Muslim world as a whole, but particularly, say, like this data about Iran and Indonesia, where conversion to Christianity is astronomical numbers. They are buying disused churches in England to turn them into mosques, but now they have plenty of disused mosques in Iran because nobody's going there. The young people have had enough of the last 25 years of rule by the Ayatollahs. It's falling apart. The church is growing in Indonesia. It's growing in China, which Confucianism has sort of got lost. It is a world that we could not have imagined when I was growing up. And the problem we have is how to fix it. What I wrote down as I was thinking about this talk is, if there is no judgment after death, is not the only good and the only important question not whether it's good or evil, but if I do it, will anybody object and will there be consequences for me? If the answer is no, go ahead and do it. That's rational if there is no judgment. But of course, you can't know for certain that there is no judgment. Pascal's razor was not a sort of, the way you read it immediately. What Pascal was after was trying to say to the unbelieving secularists, you're not actually rational because what I've just proposed to you is true. That if there is no God and you live as though there is, you don't lose very much. But if there is a God and a hell to fear and you live as you wish, you'll end up in hell. What's the rational choice to make then? So don't claim to be rational when you oppose Christianity. Face what it is. I live by my own desires. And that, of course, was what the Jews had to learn. I mean, Deuteronomy's great line, you shall not do what is right in your own eyes. From a Christian point of view, you say, God knew how hard it's going to be to get this lesson across. He was in no hurry. I mean, Adam and Eve didn't get a lot of training before they left the Garden of Eden, and their first sons, one murdered the other. It wasn't an easy life, and over the centuries, it got to the point where God said, "You are so out of control. I'm going to have a fresh start, And the flood came, and Noah came along. And Noah got into trouble in a very short time after landing, so to speak. But it then went on through all the patriarchs, and it wasn't until Sinai that the Jews were given a clear set of rules. No rationalization offered except that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You know enough about me now, he said. So these things are for your good. If you keep these 10, I call them intolerances, out of your lives, if you keep the things out of your lives, you will flourish. But we don't like that. I mean, you see in the US where the ACLU and others are furious at the thought that a judge might put the 10 Commandments on the wall of a courtroom. They talk church and state. It's not to do with church and state. This is to do with human or not human. That's where we're at. So what is the solution? Now, I wasn't an active Christian until, in the real sense of the word, until quite late in my 40s. I came to see very clearly that we do know things for which we don't have the rationale to begin with. Polanyi's wonderful insight about the fact that we have built into us insights, which he calls tacit knowledge, things we know without knowing that we know them until the pressure builds on us. And we can't describe how we know them. And the best example of that is how Christ comes into our lives. That's tacit knowledge. You can't describe it in the modern sense. You can only say, this is what I have experienced and this is what has happened to my life subsequently. You don't even have to make the mistake of claiming correlation and causation. We all have tacit knowledge all over the place. Medicine is full of it, of course. Somebody comes in to see you and you have the diagnosis in no time flat, and then you sometimes realize how it happened afterwards. But of course what it is experience. You've seen it before, you know what it's doing. There was no effective treatment in medicine to any extent until the 1860s. In fact, before the 1860s, going to the doctor correlated with dying sooner rather than later. You went to the doctor because he knew what was wrong with you and could tell you, oh, this is trivial. It's going around. You'll be fine in a week or two. And that set you carried on the same old way. But he also knew, I'm sorry, this is a serious disease. You're very unlikely to be alive in a year's time. You better get your life in order. Going to the doctor was for prognosis long before anything else. And you can't see patients every day without learning something about that, even without knowing it. Tacit knowledge. Knowledge that we can't describe in the modern reductive sense. Now, I intended to say a bit more about science, but I've already talked too much, so maybe I'll do that next week, because it's becoming more and more apparent to me that a history of science and medicine ought to be taught to the congregation at large, so to speak, which is you. I hope this will be both enjoyable, helpful, and a little challenging. And if anybody knows anything about Mick Robinson, do let me know. And if you have any other questions, some of you do, and I greatly appreciate your responses. Thank you.